Have you ever seen old maps where a huge word covers almost half of the known world? A name that seems to have been ripped from modern books as if it never existed. Tartary. For centuries, this term appeared stamped on European maps, occupying vast regions of Asia. Then, suddenly, it disappeared. Without a declared war. Without a famous historical treaty. It just vanished. Did Tartary really exist? Or are we facing one of the greatest misunderstandings in history? Imagine a 17th century map being opened on a wooden table, illuminated by candles. There it is written, in large letters, Tartary. European cartographers recorded this name to designate an immense territorial expanse that today corresponds to parts of Siberia, Mongolia, Central Asia, and regions of northern China. It wasn't a small village, it was a gigantic area. But here begins the first piece of the puzzle. The term did not necessarily mean a unified empire. In medieval and modern Europe, the world beyond known borders was often generically labeled. Unknown peoples, distant cultures, and little explored territories were given broad names, almost like provisional labels. Tartary was one of those labels, derived from the word Tatars, which Europeans used to refer to various nomadic peoples of Central Asia. The term carried both ignorance and imagination. The Tartars, in turn, were linked to the Turco-Mongol peoples who emerged on the steppes of Asia. Among them, the most famous leader was Genghis Khan. In the 13th century, he unified tribes and created the largest contiguous empire in history, the Mongol Empire. For Europeans who saw these invasions as something almost apocalyptic, it was simpler to group all those territories under a single broad name than to understand the complex political divisions of the region. But here is the crucial point. Tartary was not the official name of a centralized government. There are no records of an emperor who called himself Emperor of Tartary, nor are there standardized administrative documents using that name as an internal designation. The term appears mainly on European maps and accounts. This completely changes the tone of the investigation. So why do so many theories today claim that Tartary was a global empire erased from history? Part of the answer lies in the power of images. Ancient maps have an almost hypnotic power. When someone sees the word Tartary occupying half of Asia on a 17th century map, the first reaction is to think, this was a gigantic country. But we need to remember that ancient maps did not have the current geopolitical precision. They mixed knowledge, travelers' accounts, and even speculation. Cartographers like Gerardus Mercator produced detailed maps for the time, but still relied on limited information about distant regions. Many areas were filled in based on vague descriptions or accounts from merchants. The term Tartary, in this context, functioned almost as a placeholder, a marker to say, here live peoples whom we do not yet fully understand. Another important factor is that, over the centuries, the names of the regions changed as empires transformed. What was once generically called Tartary came to be identified more specifically. Siberia under Russian rule, Mongolia, Manchuria, Central Asia, divided into various khanates, and later incorporated into the Russian Empire, or Qing dynasty China. The expansion of the Russian Empire was decisive in this process. As the Russians advanced eastward between the 16th and 19th centuries, they began to map and administer these regions more precisely. What was once a vast, poorly defined area came to have borders, registered cities, and an administrative structure. And the generic name began to disappear, naturally. But the internet brought a new chapter to this story. In forums and videos, narratives emerged claiming that Tartary was a technologically advanced civilization, owner of monumental constructions scattered around the world. According to these theories, it was deliberately erased, and its history rewritten. This is where the role of responsible investigation comes in. There is no archaeological record to prove the existence of a global empire called Tartary, with technology superior to that of the 19th century. The constructions frequently cited in these theories, classical buildings, cathedrals, ancient railway stations, have historical documentation, identified architects, and recorded construction dates. This does not mean that sophisticated peoples did not exist in Central Asia. Quite the contrary. Civilizations such as the Mongols, the Timurids, and various Turco-Mongol Khanates had complex political structures, intense trade routes, and a profound impact on world history. The problem is confusing a broad cartographic term with a forgotten secret empire. When we look at history methodically, we realize that often the mystery arises from our difficulty in interpreting ancient documents with the right eyes. A big name on the map doesn't necessarily mean a single flag ruling over everything. And then the question returns with more force, but now with more clarity. Did Tartary exist? Yes, the term existed. It appeared on maps, in books, and in accounts for centuries. But as a unified empire and hidden global civilization, to this day there is no solid evidence to support this idea. And it is precisely in this space between what was recorded and what was imagined that the myth gains strength. To understand why Tartary became fuel for so many modern theories, we need to return to a detail that almost no one observes: how fear shapes language. When the Mongol armies advanced on Europe in the 13th century, cities were destroyed, kingdoms shaken, and the collective imagination was marked. For many Europeans, those horsemen from the steppes seemed like almost supernatural forces. The term Tartarian began to be associated not only with a people, but with something threatening. Some chroniclers even related the word to Tartarus, the abyss of hell in Greek mythology. It was ignorance mixed with dread. This psychological detail is fundamental. When a region is seen as distant, dangerous, and unknown, it tends to be simplified. Tartary became a broad label for that which was beyond European comprehension. It was not a capital, a central government, or a parliament. It was a vast cultural and geographical zone that included different peoples, languages, religions, and political systems. Meanwhile, within Asia itself, very well-defined power structures existed. Genghis Khan's legacy had fragmented the territory into several khanates. The best known of these was the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which dominated parts of Russia and profoundly influenced the development of the Russian state. There was also the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. None of them were officially called Tartary. Over the centuries, new forces emerged. The Qing dynasty consolidated power in China. The Russian Empire advanced eastward. Nomadic peoples were incorporated into larger imperial structures. What was once a complex mosaic began to gain more specific administrative divisions. Maps became more accurate. The word Tartary was replaced by more detailed regional names. But here an interesting question arises. If the term was just a European label, why did it remain on maps for so long? The answer lies in the slowness of information at that time. Without satellites or instant communication, cartographers relied on accounts from travelers, merchants, and explorers. Often they copied previous maps as a basis. A name printed on a famous map could endure for decades or even centuries. Furthermore, trade along the Silk Road connected east to west, but did not make the interior of Asia completely known. There were immense areas practically unexplored by Europeans. Given this, maintaining the name Tartary was simpler than redefining the entire geography based on fragmented information. Now fast forward a few centuries, and imagine someone in the 21st century finding an ancient map. The word Tartary occupies a gigantic area. The first reaction might be, how did this disappear? It is at this moment that legitimate curiosity meets hasty interpretation. The internet has amplified this effect. Videos with dramatic music, images of old maps, and provocative questions have created a seductive narrative. What if there was a global empire erased from history? What if ancient buildings with classical architecture were a legacy of this civilization? What if there was a great historical reset? But historical research works differently. It relies on cross-referencing documents, administrative records, archaeological findings, diplomatic correspondence, minted coins, official inscriptions. A unified empire leaves clear traces, laws, treaties, decrees, tax records. In the case of so-called Tartary as a global empire, these traces simply do not appear. This does not mean that Central Asia was empty or primitive. On the contrary, Cities like Samarkand flourished as cultural and commercial centers. Turco-Mongol peoples mastered sophisticated military techniques. The Mongol Empire itself established impressive postal systems and trade routes for its time. The difference is that these events have consistent documentation and well-defined historical names. Another important point is understanding how the evolution of cartography works. Ancient maps were not just technical instruments, they were also political and cultural expressions. By labeling an area as Tartary, European cartographers were organizing the world according to their own perspective. It was not a neutral description, it was an external view of complex territories. When the Russian Empire expanded its control over Siberia, administrative necessity demanded precision. More specific regional names emerged. Borders were defined. Censuses began to be carried out. Scientific and geographical advances naturally replaced the broad term with more precise designations. Do you see the pattern? There wasn't an official day when someone decided to erase Tartary. What happened was a gradual process of geographical refinement. Just as East Indies ceased to be a common term as specific countries were defined, Tartary lost its usefulness as understanding of the region deepened. Still, the fascination remains, perhaps because the idea of a vanished civilization is more exciting than the bureaucratic explanation of map evolution. Mystery sells. Historical complexity demands patience, and this is where the investigation becomes educational. Questioning is healthy. Observing old maps is fascinating. But transforming a cartographic label into a secret empire requires evidence that, to this day, has not appeared. And then the doubt transforms into something more sophisticated. It is no longer, did they erase an empire? But rather, how do we correctly interpret the past? There is a curious moment in history when silence speaks louder than any document. When a powerful civilization dominates vast territories, it leaves deep marks. Standardized coins, official decrees, diplomatic treaties, tax records, commemorative inscriptions. The Mongol Empire, for example, left clear traces of its administration, trade routes, and political alliances. The same happened with the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty in China. Archives, letters, military records, all of this remains available for study. When we analyze the so-called Tartary under this same criterion, something stands out. There is no internal documentary body that supports the idea of a unified empire with that name. There's no constitution, no capital officially identified as the administrative center of Tartary, no self-proclaimed Tartarian dynasty ruling the world. But then why do so many images on the internet show monumental buildings in Europe, the United States, or Russia and claim that they are Tartarian constructions? The answer lies in two modern phenomena: the aesthetics of classical architecture and the contemporary distrust of official narratives. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, architectural styles such as Neoclassical spread throughout the world. Imposing columns, grandiose domes, symmetrical facades. Many of these constructions were erected in relatively short periods, especially during world expositions. Old photographs of these fairs show entire cities built for temporary events, with structures that resembled palaces. To those who look today, it may seem impossible that they were erected with the technology of the time. But there was technology. There was rapidly advancing industrial engineering. There was abundant labor. And most importantly, there are detailed records of these constructions, signed projects, contracts, architectural plans, newspapers of the time documenting each step. The modern Tartary theory often ignores this documentation and starts from an emotional question. How did they manage to build this so quickly? The doubt is legitimate. The conspiratorial conclusion, however, requires a leap that finds no documentary support. Another important element is the so-called historical reset. The narrative suggests that there was a major global event, sometimes associated with a catastrophe, that destroyed the Tartar civilization and allowed a new elite to rewrite history. The problem is that an event of this magnitude would leave clear global geological, demographic, and archaeological evidence. Entire civilizations do not disappear without consistent physical traces. Think of the fall of the Roman Empire. Even centuries later, Ruins, documents, coins, and legal structures continue to be studied. Think of the Mayan cities. Even after the abandonment of many urban centers, pyramids, inscriptions, and artifacts remained. A technologically advanced global civilization would leave even more evident marks. There is also the linguistic question. Peoples leave behind languages, dialects, and cultural influences. Central Asia has an enormous linguistic richness, with Turkic, Mongolian, Slavic, and Sino-Tibetan languages. But there is no unified Tartar language that dominated the world and then disappeared completely. This does not mean that there are no mysteries in the story. There are many. Old maps still reveal gaps in European knowledge of the time. Regions were misinterpreted. Peoples were grouped under simplified labels. But simplification is not synonymous with conspiracy. Perhaps the most educational point of this investigation is to understand how the human mind works. Faced with a gap, we tend to fill it with coherent narratives. If we see a large name on the map and it disappears, we imagine erasure. If we see grandiose ancient buildings, we imagine lost technology. The simple explanation, evolution of knowledge and technical progress, sometimes seems unexciting, but the real story is profoundly fascinating. The Russian expansion through Siberia involved arduous expeditions, negotiations with local peoples, conflicts, and gradual cultural integration. The consolidation of the Qing dynasty involved complex political strategies. The trade routes of Central Asia connected continents for centuries. None of this needs a hidden empire to be extraordinary. And here arises a deeper reflection. Why does the idea of a lost civilization attract us so much? Perhaps because it touches on a contemporary feeling of distrust. We live in an era of information overload, but also of constant suspicion. Questioning has become almost an automatic instinct. This can be healthy when accompanied by method. It becomes problematic when it rejects any evidence that does not confirm the desired narrative. Tartary, in this context, becomes a symbol, not only of an ancient territory, but of a modern tension between curiosity and evidence, between imagination and documentation. The initial question, did Tartary really exist, no longer seems so simple. The name existed. The cartographic label existed. Powerful peoples and empires dominated those regions. But the hidden, technologically superior, and deliberately erased global empire still lacks solid proof. And perhaps the most important question is not just about Tartary, but about how we decide what to believe. After traversing ancient maps, real empires, historical documents, and modern theories, the question returns to center stage. After all, did Tartary really exist? Yes, as a historical and cartographic term. For centuries, the word appeared on European maps to designate vast regions of Asia little known to Westerners. It was a broad label used to simplify territories inhabited by various Turco-Mongol peoples. It was not a country with an official flag, nor a central government with a recognized capital. No, if we are talking about a hidden, technologically advanced global empire that would have been erased from history in a great reset. To this day, there are no administrative records, standardized currencies, imperial decrees, official inscriptions, or archaeological findings that prove this unified structure under the name Tartary. What did exist, demonstrably, were great regional powers. The Mongol Empire changed the course of world history. The expansion of the Russian Empire completely reorganized the map of Eurasia. The Qing dynasty consolidated vast territories under Chinese rule. These historical processes explain why the name Tartary was gradually replaced by more specific designations. The disappearance of the term was not a sudden act of global censorship. It was the result of advances in cartography, state administration, and geographical science. As regions became better understood and politically organized, the generic label lost its usefulness. But there is a bigger lesson here. History is not just a collection of facts. It is also the way we interpret old documents. Maps are not photographs of reality. They are representations made with the knowledge available at a given time. When we see the word Tartary occupying half of Asia, reflects the European view of the time, not necessarily the region's internal political structure. Modern theories about Tartary reveal something profound about our time. There is an enormous curiosity about hidden narratives. There is a fascination with the idea that something grand was hidden. Questioning is healthy. Investigating is essential. But investigation needs to go hand in hand with verifiable evidence. The true richness of this history lies not in a secret, erased empire. It lies in the complexity of the peoples of Central Asia, in the trade routes that connected continents, in the political transformations that shaped the modern world. It lies in how knowledge evolves. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: when something seems to have been erased from history, the first question should not be who hid it, but how was this term used at the time? Tartary existed as a name. It existed as a European concept for distant lands. But the idea of a lost super-empire belongs much more to the contemporary imagination than to historical archives. And now the decision is yours. Do you prefer comfortable mystery or documented complexity? Because sometimes the truth is no less fascinating. It just requires us to look more closely.